Ein mysteriöser Panzer terrorisierte 3 Tage lang ein französisches Regiment. Niemand konnte ihn identifizieren. Niemand konnte ihn stoppen. Er zerstörte ihre besten Fahrzeuge mit chirurgischer Präzision und verschwand spurlos im Nebel. Als die Franzosen endlich ihren stärksten Panther schickten, um diesen Geist zu jagen, entdeckten sie eine schockierende Wahrheit, die die Zukunft der Panzerkriegsführung für immer verändern würde. Wenn du wissen willst, wie diese unglaubliche Geschichte endet, lass einen Like da, abonniere den Kanal und schreib in die Kommentare, aus welchem Land du uns zuschaust. The morning fog clung to the French countryside like a shroud, thick and impenetrable, masking everything beyond 30 meters in a wall of gray. Captain Marcel Dubois stood in the turret of his Panther tank, the pride of the 503rd Tank Regiment, scanning the horizon with binoculars that revealed nothing but shadows and mist. They had been tracking reports of an unknown armored vehicle for 3 days now, something that didn't match any silhouette in their recognition manuals, something that seemed to vanish whenever they got close. "Contact lost again, sir," reported Lieutenant Beaumont over the radio, frustration evident in his crackling voice. "Whatever this thing is, it knows the terrain better than we do." Marcel lowered his binoculars, his jaw tightening. 3 destroyed supply trucks, 2 reconnaissance vehicles ambushed, and 1 Char B-1 left smoking in a ditch. The pattern was always the same. Strike hard, strike fast, disappear before reinforcements arrived. Intelligence suggested it was a single vehicle, possibly a prototype or captured equipment being tested in the field. But tested by whom? The war had been over for months, yet someone was conducting their own private campaign in the French sector. The Panther beneath Marcel's feet represented the pinnacle of armored warfare technology. Captured from the Germans and refurbished with French markings, it was a beast of steel and firepower, with sloped armor that could deflect almost anything and an 80mm gun that could punch through any known tank at range. Marcel had personally overseen its restoration, studied every mechanism, understood every advantage it possessed. If anyone could hunt down this ghost tank, it was him. But something about this situation felt wrong. The attacks were too precise, too calculated. Whoever commanded that mystery vehicle understood armored tactics at a level that suggested professional military training. The question that kept Marcel awake at night wasn't just who they were fighting, but why no one seemed to know what they were fighting with. "Sir, headquarters on the line," called out Sergeant Rousseau from inside the tank. "They want a status update." Marcel dropped back into the turret, taking the handset. "This is Eagle 1, still tracking the target. No visual confirmation. Eagle 1, this is command." The voice of Colonel Arnaud filled his headset, stern and impatient. "We're running out of time. The Allied Commission arrives in 72 hours. To inspect our sector. We cannot have an unknown hostile operating freely in our zone of control. Use whatever force necessary, but shut this down. Now." The radio went dead before Marcel could respond. 72 hours. The pressure was mounting from above, and he understood why. If word got out that the French couldn't secure their own territory, that some phantom tank was making fools of them, the embarrassment would be catastrophic. The post-war military was already under scrutiny. Budgets were being cut, and any sign of incompetence could have far-reaching consequences. "Did you hear that?" Marcel asked his crew. "Every word, sir," replied Corporal Henri from the driver's position. 72 hours to catch a ghost. "Then we'd better start believing in ghosts," Marcel said, studying the map spread across his lap. "Look at these attack sites. They're not random. There's a pattern here, but I can't quite see it." Beaumont's voice crackled over the radio again. "Sir, civilian. Report just came in. Farm family about 5 kilometers northeast saw something unusual in their barn yesterday evening. Said it looked like a tank, but smaller, oddly shaped. They didn't get a good look before it moved on." Marcel's pulse quickened. "Northeast. That puts it in the forest zone near Below Wood. Dense terrain, sir. Perfect for an ambush, or perfect for us to corner it." Marcel keyed his radio to the full regiment frequency. "All units converge on grid reference. 479231. Maintain spacing. Watch your flanks. Whatever this thing is, we're ending this today." The Panther's engine roared to life, and they began moving across the muddy field toward the tree line. Marcel felt the familiar vibration of the tank beneath him, the raw power of German engineering that had terrified Allied forces throughout the war. Now that power was his to command, and he intended to use every advantage it offered. The fog began to lift as they approached. The forest, revealing the skeletal remains of trees that had been shattered by artillery years ago. Bellow Wood had been a killing ground in the previous war, and remnants of that carnage still littered the landscape. Rusted barbed wire, collapsed trenches, the occasional skull grinning from the mud. It was a place where ghosts should feel at home. Movement, 11 o'clock, 200 meters. Henri suddenly called out. Marcel swung his binoculars toward the indicated direction. There, between the trees, he caught a glimpse of something moving, low and fast. The silhouette was wrong, all wrong. It wasn't a Panther, wasn't a Sherman, wasn't any tank he recognized. It looked almost like a box with tracks, compact and angular, painted in a mottled camouflage that made it blend perfectly with the forest shadows. Target acquired, Marcel said calmly, though his heart was hammering. Gunner, prepare to engage. Sir, I can't get a clear shot. It's moving behind the trees. Then we follow it in. All units, maintain pursuit. Don't let it slip away again. The Panther pushed into the forest, branches scraping against its armor. The mystery tank was moving with surprising agility through the dense terrain, weaving between trees that should have been impossible for an armored vehicle to navigate. Marcel realized with growing unease that whatever this vehicle was, it had been designed for exactly this kind of environment. It's leading us somewhere, Beaumont radioed. Sir, this feels like a trap. Everything's a trap if you think about it too much, Marcel replied, but he couldn't shake the same feeling. The mystery tank wasn't fleeing randomly. It was moving with purpose, drawing them deeper into the forest, away from open ground where the Panther's superior range and firepower would dominate. A sudden explosion erupted 50 meters to their left, one of Beaumont's supporting tanks lurching to a halt as a track shattered. The mystery tank had fired without, Marcel even seeing it position itself. The shot had been perfect, disabling rather than destroying, suggesting either limited ammunition or a commander who preferred precision over overkill. Contact left, someone screamed over the radio. Marcel caught another glimpse of the strange vehicle darting between the trees, impossibly quick, impossibly small. How could something that compact mount a gun capable of damaging a tank? The questions were piling up faster than answers, and time was running out. Split formation, Marcel ordered. Beaumont, circle north. Rousseau, take your section south. We'll pin it between us. The Panther crew executed the maneuver with practiced efficiency, the massive tank surprisingly nimble despite its size. Marcel's mind raced through everything he knew about tank warfare, every tactical principle he'd learned, every engagement he'd studied. This was unlike anything in his experience. The mystery vehicle fought like a guerrilla, using the terrain as a weapon, appearing and disappearing at will. Another shot rang out, this time striking Rousseau's lead tank on the turret ring. The shell didn't penetrate, but the impact was enough to jam the turret traverse. 2 tanks disabled in as many minutes, and Marcel still hadn't gotten a clean shot at their opponent. Sir, I've got eyes on it, Henri shouted. Dead ahead, 100 meters, stationary. Marcel's training took over. Gunner, target center mass. Fire when ready. On target. Firing. The Panther's 88-meter gun roared, the recoil rocking the entire tank. Marcel watched through his optics as the armor-piercing round streaked toward the mystery vehicle, and missed, the target jerking forward at the last possible instant. Impossible. No one could time a movement that precisely, anticipating the exact moment of firing. Unless they could hear the gun mechanism, Marcel realized with a chill. Unless whoever commanded that tank had such intimate knowledge of Panther operations that they knew the exact sound the firing mechanism made a split second before the gun discharged. Reload fast! But the mystery tank was already moving, circling to their flank where the Panther's armor was thinner. Marcel rotated the turret frantically, trying to track the darting target. Every principle of tank combat said this was impossible. The lighter vehicle should be retreating, not pressing an attack against a vastly superior opponent. Brace for impact, Henri yelled. The shell struck. Their right track assembly, a precise surgical shot that severed the track without penetrating the armor. The Panther lurched to a stop, immobilized but not destroyed. Marcel's blood ran cold as he realized what had just happened. They'd been disabled with the same clinical efficiency as the other tanks. Their opponent wasn't trying to kill them. They were systematically neutralizing threats while conserving ammunition. This wasn't a desperate fighter or a rogue soldier. This was a professional elite, conducting a very specific operation, and Marcel and his regiment were just obstacles to be removed from the board. "All units, fall back," Marcel ordered, abandoning pride for pragmatism. "Retreat to open ground where we can regroup." "Sir, we can still fight," protested Rousseau. "Against an enemy we can't see? An enemy who just disabled our best tank without breaking a sweat? Fall back now, that's an order." The remaining French tanks withdrew from the forest, leaving 3 immobilized. Panthers behind. Marcel climbed out of his turret, standing on the roof of his crippled vehicle, staring into the shadows where their opponent had vanished once again. He'd commanded armor for 5 years, fought through some of the most brutal tank battles of the war, and he'd never felt so thoroughly outmaneuvered. As the fog began to roll back in with the approaching evening, Marcel saw something that made his pulse quicken. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree, fresh and deliberate, was a simple message in French. "Tomorrow, open field, noon, come ready." A direct challenge. The mystery tank's commander was done playing hide-and-seek in the forest. They wanted a decisive engagement, tank versus tank, in terrain where there would be no ambiguity about the outcome. Marcel felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. Tomorrow they would finally see what they were dealing with. The question was whether they would survive the revelation. Night fell over the French countryside, and Marcel sat in the command tent, poring over every scrap of intelligence they'd gathered. The mysterious tank was small, highly maneuverable, and armed with a gun powerful enough to disable Panthers. The crew, assuming it had more than one person, demonstrated expert knowledge of German tank operations. The attacks had been surgical, professional, and increasingly bold. "What are we missing?" Colonel Arnaud demanded, pacing behind Marcel's chair. "How can one tank make fools of an entire regiment?" "Because we're asking the wrong questions, sir," Marcel replied, not looking up from his notes. "We keep asking what we're fighting. We should be asking who trained them and why they're doing this." "Enlighten me, Captain." Marcel pointed to the map where he'd marked each attack site. "Look at the pattern. Every target was either a supply convoy or a reconnaissance element. They're not attacking civilians or trying to cause maximum casualties. They're specifically targeting our operational capability while avoiding unnecessary killing. This isn't terrorism or revenge. This is someone conducting a very specific test." "A test of what?" "Of their vehicle's capabilities against our best equipment, in various terrain and tactical situations. Sir, I think we're dealing with a prototype. Someone is field testing a new tank design using us as the opposition force." Arnaud's face darkened. "You're saying someone is using French territory as their private proving ground?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And tomorrow at noon, they want to conduct the final examination, a head-to-head engagement against our Panther in open terrain. They want to see if their design can beat the best tank we have in a fair fight. Then we'll give them a fight they won't forget. I want every available tank positioned around that field. The moment this mystery vehicle appears, we hit it with everything." Marcel shook his head. "No, sir. If we swarm them, we learn nothing. They'll adapt or retreat and we'll be back to square one. They challenged us to single combat for a reason. I think we should accept. You're volunteering to face this thing alone? Someone has to. And I'm the best tank commander we have." Marcel met his colonel's gaze steadily. "Besides, we need to know what this vehicle can do. If this is a prototype being tested, that means someone, somewhere, is planning to build more. We need intelligence more than we need revenge." Arnaud was silent for a long moment. "Very well, Captain. But you'll have support positioned beyond visual range. At the first sign of treachery, they move in. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Marcel spent the rest of the night preparing, going over every system on his Panther, checking and rechecking ammunition loads, studying angle calculations and armor penetration tables. If this was going to be a duel, he intended to win it. But more than that, he intended to understand his opponent. Every shot they fired, every movement they made, would reveal something about their vehicle's capabilities and limitations. Dawn broke gray and cold, the kind of morning where breath misted and metal felt like ice. Marcel and his crew drove their repaired Panther to the designated field, a flat expanse of grassland with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Perfect conditions for a tank engagement, where superior armor and firepower would tell the tale. They waited. Noon approached with agonizing slowness. Marcel stood in his turret, scanning the horizon, wondering if their opponent would even show. Perhaps the challenge had been a bluff, a way to buy time for an escape. Perhaps movement, north side of the field, Henri reported. Marcel swung his binoculars around and finally got his first clear look at the mystery tank. It emerged from the tree line slowly, almost casually, and Marcel felt his breath catch. The vehicle was like nothing he'd ever seen. Low profile, angular, with sloped armor that looked even more extreme than the Panthers. It was barely half the size of his tank, painted in an unusual mottled green and brown pattern. The turret was compact but well proportioned, and the gun. Marcel's experienced eye immediately recognized the weapon as something special. Mon Dieu, breathed Sergeant Rousseau. What is that thing? The mystery tank rolled to a stop about 500 meters away, sitting motionless in the middle of the field. Marcel could see a figure standing in the turret, mimicking his own position. Even at this distance, he could sense the challenger's confidence. Then the radio crackled to life with a voice Marcel hadn't expected. Smooth, educated, speaking perfect French with just the hint of a German accent. Good morning, Captain Dubois. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I am Major Klaus Richter, formerly of the Wehrmacht Panzer Corps, currently employed as a design consultant. The vehicle I command is a prototype designated Jagdpanzer-Experimental 7. What you've been hunting these past days isn't a ghost, Captain. It's the future. Marcel keyed his radio, keeping his voice steady despite the shock. A German officer conducting unauthorized operations in French territory. Major Richter, you realize this is an act of war? The war's over, Captain. What I'm conducting is a practical examination. Your military has captured and operates several Panthers, making you ideal test subjects. I needed to understand how my design performs against the best. Tanks in the field, in realistic combat conditions. You and your regiment have provided invaluable data. We're not your laboratory specimens, Major. Of course not. You're soldiers, professionals, and you've performed admirably. But now comes the real test. Your Panther represents proven, combat-tested technology. My Jagdpanzer represents the next generation. One tank, one crew, open field. Let's see which philosophy wins. Heavy armor and firepower, or speed and precision. Marcel felt anger rising in his chest. This isn't a game, Richter. No, Captain. It's much more important than a game. It's validation. The winning design will influence tank development for decades. The losing design will be forgotten. History will be written today, in this field, between you and me. Are you ready to make history? Marcel looked at his crew. Henri's hands were tight on the controls. Rousseau's face was pale, but determined. Beaumont, manning the gun, gave a slight nod. They were ready. More than that, they were angry. This German had toyed with them, used them, treated them like test dummies. Now it was time to show him what French tankers could do. Whenever you are, Major, Marcel replied coldly. Excellent. Rules are simple. First tank to achieve a killing shot wins. No retreat, no surrender. May the best design prevail. The radio went silent. For a long moment, both tanks sat motionless, commanders staring at each other across 500 meters of empty field. Marcel's mind raced through calculations. The Panther's armor could withstand most hits from the front. His gun could punch through anything at this range. The mystery Jagdpanzer was smaller, probably faster, but size meant lighter armor. In a straight fight, advantage Panther. But Klaus Richter hadn't challenged him to a straight fight just to lose. Henri, engine to full power. Be ready to move on my command. Beaumont, target center mass. Wait for my order. Ready, sir. Marcel watched the Jagdpanzer through his optics, looking for the telltale signs that would indicate movement. Every tank commander had unconscious habits, tiny preparatory movements before executing a maneuver. If he could read Richter's intentions even a fraction of a second early, the Jagdpanzer exploded forward with shocking acceleration, zigging left then right, closing the distance at a speed that should have been impossible for an armored vehicle. Marcel barely had time to shout, "Evasive!" before a shell screamed past. Where they'd been sitting, Richter had fired on the move, a nearly impossible shot, and come within meters of hitting them. Return fire. Now! Beaumont's shot went wide as the Jagdpanzer juked again, its low profile making it a difficult target. Marcel realized with growing alarm that every assumption he'd made was wrong. The German vehicle wasn't slower. It was faster. It wasn't avoiding a slugging match. It was dictating the terms of engagement. And Klaus Richter wasn't fighting like a man, testing a prototype. He was fighting like someone who knew exactly what his machine could do. The Panther's advantage in armor meant nothing if they couldn't hit their target, and the Jagdpanzer's gun, whatever it was, had enough punch to threaten them even at range. This wasn't David versus Goliath. This was a chess match where both players had different pieces, and Marcel was just beginning to understand the rules. The Jagdpanzer circled them at high speed, forcing the Panther to rotate its turret constantly. Marcel recognized the tactic. Keep them off balance, never give them a stable firing solution, wait for an opening. But the Panther's turret traverse was excellent, and Beaumont was one of the best gunners in the regiment. Lead the target, Beaumont. Anticipate the turn. On it, sir. Firing. The 80mm gun roared, the shell passing just ahead of the Jagdpanzer. But Richter had anticipated the anticipation, slowing fractionally at exactly the right moment. The near miss still must have been close enough to rattle the German crew, because the Jagdpanzer suddenly reversed direction, putting distance between them. He's reassessing, Marcel muttered. He knows we're dangerous now. Both tanks faced each other at 400 meters, and Marcel could almost feel the German commander's tactical mind working through the same calculations he was. At this range, the Panther's superior optics and fire control gave them an edge. Closer, the Jagdpanzer's speed and maneuverability would dominate, but neither could maintain this standoff indefinitely. Henri, when I give the word, full speed ahead, straight at them. Beaumont, rapid fire, keep them suppressed. Sir, that's suicide, Rousseau protested. No, it's forcing his hand. Richter wants to study how his tank performs. He won't risk it in a head-on collision. He'll break off, and when he does, he'll expose his flank. That's when we take the shot. That's insane, sir. It's war, Sergeant, now. The Panther surged forward, its massive engine propelling 45 tons of steel directly at the smaller Jagdpanzer. Beaumont fired repeatedly, not aiming for hits, but for effect, throwing up dirt and smoke around the German tank. Marcel watched through his optics as the distance closed. 300 meters, 250, 200. The Jagdpanzer held position longer than Marcel expected, Richter calling his bluff, waiting to see if the French captain would really commit to a collision. At 150 meters, the German tank finally broke, spinning hard to the right, and for one perfect instant, its side armor was exposed. Now, Beaumont! Now! The gunner fired, the shot perfectly calculated, leading the target by exactly the right amount. Marcel saw the armor-piercing round streak through the air, saw it impact the Jagdpanzer's side just below the turret ring, saw the shell bounced off, deflected by the extreme angle of the German tank's armor, ricocheting into the sky. Impossible, Marcel whispered. Even at that range, even with a perfect shot against side armor, the Jagdpanzer's design had defeated them. The sloped armor wasn't just on the front. It was all around, creating a tank that had no weak points, no vulnerable angles. Every surface was designed to deflect rather than resist, turning the enemy's power against them. And now the Jagdpanzer was circling behind them, where the Panther's armor was thinnest. Reverse. Get us turned around. But Henri was, already moving, the experienced driver knowing what was needed without being told. The Panther pivoted, turret swinging, trying to keep the German tank in front. But the Jagdpanzer was faster, more agile, and Klaus Richter was a master at using those advantages. A shell slammed into their rear, penetrating just enough to damage the engine, but not catastrophically. The Panther shuddered, power dropping, mobility compromised. Marcel realized with cold certainty that Richter had done it again. A disabling shot, not a killing shot, maintaining his pattern of surgical precision. Engine's dying, sir, Henri reported. We've got maybe 30 seconds of power left. Marcel made a decision. Beaumont, give me manual traverse on the turret. Henri, give me everything you've got left. One more turn, one more shot. That's all we need. The wounded Panther rotated ponderously, turret swinging around with painful slowness. The Jagdpanzer was positioning for the kill shot, taking its time. Richter, confident in his victory. But confidence could breed carelessness. and Marcel was betting everything on one moment of opportunity. Beaumont, where will he shoot from? 10 o'clock, 100 meters, elevated position on that small rise. Perfect hold-down location. Then we aim at that spot before he gets there. Pre-position the gun, hold fire until he crests the rise, then immediately fire. We'll get one chance. Sir, that's brilliant or insane. Probably both. Do it. The turret locked into position, aimed at empty ground. The Panther's engine gave one final surge, positioning them correctly, then died with a mechanical groan. They were immobile, nearly defenseless, with one shot left. The Jagdpanzer appeared exactly where Beaumont predicted, rising up onto the small hill, gun depressing to take the killing shot. For a frozen instant, both tanks had perfect firing solutions on each other. Two crews, two commanders, two philosophies of warfare, all distilled into a single moment of action. Fire, Marcel said calmly. Both guns fired simultaneously. The world exploded in sound and fury. Marcel felt the impact as Richter's shell struck their turret face. But the Panther's heavy frontal armor held, the shell failing to penetrate. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcel saw their own shot impact the Jagdpanzer dead on. But impossibly, incredibly, the German tank was still moving. Their shell had hit, had struck true, but the Jagdpanzer's armor had somehow defeated even the Panther's powerful gun. The prototype backed away, and Marcel could see damage on its front plate, a deep gouge where steel had held against steel. But held it had. The radio crackled one final time. Richter's voice was subdued, respectful. Well played, Captain Dubois. Under different circumstances, I think we would have enjoyed serving together. But today's test is complete. My compliments to you and your crew. You fought brilliantly. Richter, wait! But the Jagdpanzer was already accelerating away, heading for the tree line at high speed. Within seconds, it vanished into the forest, leaving Marcel and his disabled Panther sitting in the middle of the field. Silence descended, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the heavy breathing of exhausted men. Marcel climbed out of his turret, legs shaky, staring at the spot where the German tank had disappeared. They'd lost. Not in any conventional sense. Both tanks had survived, both crews were intact, but they'd been comprehensively outfought by a vehicle that shouldn't exist, and a commander who operated outside all normal protocols. Support tanks began emerging from the tree line. Colonel Arnault's voice harsh over the radio. All units, pursue. Don't let that tank escape. But Marcel knew it was futile. Klaus Richter had proven his point, gathered his data, and now he would vanish as mysteriously as he'd appeared. The Jagdpanzer prototype would disappear into some secret facility, and the French military would be left with nothing but questions and wounded pride. Except that wasn't quite true. As Marcel stood on his damaged tank, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, he realized they'd learned something far more important than the outcome of a single engagement. They'd seen the future of armored warfare, smaller, faster, more efficient tanks that relied on design brilliance rather than brute force. The age of massive, heavily armored behemoths like the Panther was ending. A new era was beginning, and the French military needed to adapt or be left behind. Sir, are you all right? Rousseau called up from inside the tank. I'm fine, Sergeant. Just thinking about how much the world has changed. Marcel paused, then added quietly, and how much more it's going to change. That evening, in the command tent, Colonel Arnault was furious, demanding explanations, threatening investigations. But Marcel was barely listening. His mind was far away, already composing the after-action report that would change everything. He would tell them about the Jagdpanzer's capabilities, its revolutionary design, the way it had effortlessly defeated tanks that had dominated the European battlefield. He would explain how one man with vision and skill had made fools of an entire regiment, and most importantly, he would recommend that France immediately begin developing similar vehicles. Because if Klaus Richter could build such a machine, others could too. And the next time they faced such a tank, it might not be in a controlled duel with rules. It might be in actual combat, with real stakes and no second chances. Captain Dubois, Arnault snapped, pulling Marcel from his thoughts. I asked you a question. Why didn't you disable that tank when you had the chance? Sir, with respect, we did have the chance. Several chances, in fact. We failed to capitalize on them because we were outthought, outmaneuvered, and fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics. That Tank, the Jagdpanzer-Experimental 7, represents a fundamental shift in armored warfare philosophy. We can't beat it by applying old solutions to new problems. So you're saying we lost because we're obsolete? No, sir. I'm saying we lost because we didn't understand what we were fighting until it was too late. But now we do understand. And that knowledge is more valuable than any victory today would have been. Marcel met his colonel's gaze steadily. Major Richter gave us a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one. He showed us the path forward. The question is whether we're smart enough to follow it. Arno was silent for a long moment, anger slowly giving way to thoughtful consideration. Write your report, Captain. Make it detailed, and make it convincing, because I'll be presenting it to the General Staff next week. If you're right about this prototype representing the future, then we need to ensure France doesn't get left in the past. Marcel nodded and left the tent. Outside, the stars were emerging in a clear night sky, and somewhere out there, Klaus Richter was probably writing his own report, analyzing the engagement from his perspective, refining his design based on what he'd learned. Two professionals on opposite sides of a conflict that had officially ended, still competing, still pushing each other toward excellence. The morning after what Marcel would forever think of as the duel, he walked out to examine his Panther in the cold dawn light. The damage was significant but repairable. A mangled track, a damaged engine, and several impressive dents where German shells had tested the armor's limits. His crew was already at work, assessing what could be fixed in the field and what would require depot-level maintenance. "Sir, you should see this," called Beaumont from the turret. Marcel climbed up and found his gunner holding a small metal object, a spent shell casing, but not from any weapon in the French or German inventory. It was slightly smaller than standard 88mm ammunition, with unusual markings stamped into the base. "Found it lodged in the armor skirt, sir. Must have bounced off during the engagement." Marcel turned the casing over in his hands, studying it carefully. The metallurgy was excellent, the manufacturing precision remarkable. Whatever gun Klaus Richter had been using, it fired specialized ammunition designed specifically for his prototype. This wasn't a weapon pulled from existing stockpiles. This was custom-built, engineered from the ground up for maximum effect. "Bag it as evidence," Marcel ordered. "This goes in the report." Over the next 3 days, Marcel threw himself into documenting everything about the engagement. He interviewed every crew member, reviewed every radio transmission, even walked the battlefield with a survey team, measuring distances and calculating angles. The picture that emerged was both impressive and disturbing. The Jagdpanzer-Experimental 7 was a masterpiece of focused design. Every aspect of its construction served a specific purpose. The low profile reduced its visual signature. The sloped armor maximized protection without excess weight. The powerful engine-to-weight ratio provided exceptional mobility. And the gun, whatever revolutionary weapon it mounted, delivered devastating accuracy even on the move. It was a tank designed by someone who understood that modern warfare rewarded thinking differently, not just thinking bigger. But what troubled Marcel most wasn't the technical aspects. It was the implications. If one man, even a brilliant engineer like Klaus Richter apparently was, could build such a machine, what were entire nations with unlimited resources creating in their secret facilities? The tank duel in the French countryside was just a tiny preview of a new arms race that was already underway, hidden from public view but moving forward with frightening momentum. His report eventually ran to 57 pages, filled with technical diagrams, tactical analysis, and strategic recommendations. Marcel pulled no punches in his conclusions. The age of the heavy tank was ending, and France needed to immediately begin developing lighter, more maneuverable designs that emphasized protection through geometry rather than mass. The Panther, for all its proven capabilities, represented the peak of one evolutionary path. The Jagdpanzer represented the beginning of another. When he finally submitted the report to Colonel Arnaud, the older officer spent 3 hours reading it without interruption. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. "This is going to cause quite a stir, Captain. You're essentially telling the General Staff that everything they know about tank warfare is obsolete." "No, sir. I'm telling them that everything they know needs to evolve. There's a difference. The fundamentals of armored combat, fire, maneuver, protection, those haven't changed. But how we achieve those fundamentals has to change. The Panther was a magnificent achievement for 1944. But this is 1948, and the world has moved on. And you think this German major has shown us the way forward? I think he's shown us one possible way forward. There might be others. But what I know for certain is that standing still isn't an option. If we don't innovate, we'll end up like the French cavalry in 1940, brave, professional, and completely irrelevant. Arnaud nodded slowly. I'll forward this up the chain. But Captain, you realize this might end. Your career? The people above me don't like being told they're wrong, especially by junior officers. I'm aware, sir, but I've seen what's coming, and I can't pretend I haven't. If that costs me my career, so be it. At least I'll know I tried to prepare us for the future instead of clinging to the past. 3 weeks later, Marcel was summoned to Paris. He'd expected a reprimand, possibly even a court-martial for allowing the German tank to escape. What he found instead was a room full of generals, engineers, and intelligence officers, all eager to hear firsthand about his encounter with the Jagdpanzer. The debriefing lasted 2 days. Marcel answered hundreds of questions, described every detail he could remember, and endured skepticism from officers who couldn't believe a single prototype could pose such a threat. But he also found allies. Forward-thinking officers who understood that warfare was entering a new phase, engineers who were excited by the technical possibilities, and intelligence analysts who were trying to track down Klaus Richter and determine exactly who he was working for. On the final day, Marcel was called into a private meeting with General Leclerc himself, one of France's most respected military leaders. Captain Dubois, I've read your report 3 times. Each time I found myself more convinced and more concerned. This Jagdpanzer represents a serious capability gap. But what concerns me more is your assessment that this isn't an isolated EU development. You believe other nations are pursuing similar designs? I do, sir. Major Richter didn't build that tank in a vacuum. Someone funded it, someone provided facilities and materials, someone saw enough potential to risk testing it against active military forces. That kind of support suggests government or industrial backing at a high level. And if one nation is doing this, others certainly are. Then we need to catch up. I'm authorizing the formation of a special research group. You'll be seconded to work with our engineers and designers. Your mission: develop France's answer to the Jagdpanzer. You have 2 years and a blank check. Succeed, and you'll have secured France's place in the next generation of warfare. Fail? Well, let's not consider that option. Marcel felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. This was an incredible opportunity, but also an enormous responsibility. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm a tanker, not an engineer. You're a tanker who understands what future tanks need to do. That's more valuable than any amount of technical expertise without practical combat experience. You fought against the future, Captain. Now you're going to help us build it. And so Marcel's life took an unexpected turn. Instead of commanding tanks in the field, he found himself in design studios and testing facilities, working with some of France's brightest minds to create a vehicle that could match or exceed the Jagdpanzer's capabilities. It was challenging, frustrating, exhilarating work. Every decision involved trade-offs. Every design choice had consequences. But through it all, Marcel never forgot the lesson Klaus Richter had taught him in that field. Excellence comes from thinking differently, not just working harder. The future belongs to those who can see past the present, who can imagine possibilities that don't yet exist, who can turn revolutionary ideas into revolutionary reality. Years later, when the first prototype of France's new light tank rolled off the assembly line, Marcel stood watching with quiet pride. It wasn't a copy of the Jagdpanzer. That would have been a failure of imagination. Instead, it was France's own answer to the challenge Richter had posed, a vehicle that combined the best of French engineering tradition with bold new concepts, a tank that honored the past while racing toward the future. As he watched the prototype maneuver through its trials, Marcel found himself wondering about Klaus Richter. Where was the German major now? Was he watching his own designs being tested? Was he satisfied with how his experiment had influenced armored development worldwide? Did he ever think about that day in the French countryside, when 2 professionals had faced each other across an empty field, fighting not for nations or ideologies, but for the simple, pure ideal of excellence in their craft? Marcel suspected he did, because that's what true professionals do. They remember the challenges that pushed them beyond their limits, the opponents who made them better through competition, The moments when everything came down to skill and will and determination. That duel had been many things: a tactical engagement, a technological demonstration, a test of capabilities. But most of all, it had been two masters of their profession paying each other the ultimate compliment, taking each other seriously, fighting with full commitment, and in the end, respecting what they'd learned from each other. The French never did catch Klaus Richter. Intelligence reports suggested he'd moved to South America, or perhaps the United States, continuing his work on advanced armored vehicle designs under new patronage. His Jagdpanzer-Experimental 7 was never seen again, presumably either destroyed or locked away in some secret facility. But its influence rippled outward, affecting tank development across multiple nations, pushing designers to think differently about protection, mobility, and firepower. Marcel's own project eventually evolved into one of France's most successful post-war designs, earning him promotion and recognition. But whenever young officers asked him for advice, he always told them the same story, about a mysterious German tank that appeared in the French countryside, about a challenge accepted and a lesson learned, about the day he discovered that true excellence meant never stopping, never settling, always pushing toward the next horizon. The Panther was an excellent tank, he would tell them, one of the best of its generation, but excellent for its generation isn't the same as excellent, period. The moment you stop innovating, you start becoming obsolete. Major Richter understood that. He built his Jagdpanzer not to win one battle, but to challenge an entire way of thinking, and in doing so, he won a far more important victory than anything that could be decided in a single engagement. "Did you ever want revenge, sir?" they would ask. For, being outfought that day? Marcel would smile at that question. Revenge? No. Gratitude, perhaps. Klaus Richter gave me a gift. He showed me what was possible when you combined technical excellence with tactical brilliance and strategic vision. He forced me to become better, to think more deeply, to push beyond what I thought were my limits. How could I want revenge for that? If anything, I'm in his debt. As the decades passed and Marcel eventually retired from active service, he maintained his interest in armored warfare development. He watched as tanks evolved in exactly the directions he and Richter had pioneered. Lighter, faster, more efficient, with protection coming from design rather than just steel thickness. The heavy tanks of World War II gradually disappeared, replaced by vehicles that would have been unimaginable to tankers of that earlier era. And sometimes, late at night in his study, Marcel would take out that spent shell casing, the one Beaumont had found lodged in his Panther's armor, and turn it over in his hands, remembering that morning in the fog when they'd first begun hunting the ghost tank, remembering the duel in the open field, remembering the moment he realized he was facing not just a superior machine, but a superior mind. The casing was engraved now, mounted on a plaque in his study, with a simple inscription: "Excellence recognizes excellence, French countryside, 1948. It wasn't a trophy of victory or a reminder of defeat. It was something more important, a symbol of the moment when the future arrived unannounced, challenged the present to a duel, and won not through overwhelming force, but through superior thinking. That, Marcel had learned, was the real lesson of the Jagdpanzer-Experimental 7. Not that new designs would replace old ones, that was inevitable, but that excellence was a moving target, always advancing, always evolving, always demanding more from those who pursued it. The moment you thought you'd achieved it, someone like Klaus Richter would appear to show you how much further you could go. And for that lesson, delivered at the business end of a revolutionary tank gun on a foggy morning in post-war France, Captain Marcel Dubois would be forever grateful.